Today I'm going to be responding to my friend Phenomphilosophy regarding one of his objections to the Kalam cosmological argument. But it's going to be a pretty friendly response. Phenomphilosophy and I recently connected on here, and we're actually talking about doing some discussions and collaborations. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and respond to one of the objections he raised against the Kalam cosmological argument. Because for one, the Kalam is actually one of my favorite classical arguments for God's existence. And secondly, it's one of the main arguments that I've promoted myself on my channel, so I feel somewhat obligated to respond. The objection that Phenomphilosophy raises is against the first premise of the argument as it relates to creatio ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. In his video, Phenomphilosophy says that since, in our world, we create things from already existing matter, there would need to be a demonstration of creatio ex nihilo in order to establish the first premise. So to me, it sounds like Phenomphilosophy is saying the only kind of evidence that is acceptable pertaining to this premise is that of the empirical sort. Now, the interesting thing about that is that this argument isn't an empirical argument. It's a philosophical argument. So we're not arguing for creatio ex nihilo from an empirical standpoint, but rather we're arguing for it from a philosophical standpoint. So I don't see how someone can justifiably say that a philosophical argument needs empirical evidence for it to hold. I think philosophical arguments stand just fine on their own merit, namely philosophical reasoning. And that's the point of a philosophical argument, because with a philosophical argument, we're trying to go beyond the empirical world. We're talking about something more fundamental to reality than empirical evidence deals with. Empirical evidence deals with the here and now in the physical world, but the argument for creatio ex nihilo goes far beyond that. So I think it's a category error for someone to claim that there needs to be empirical evidence to justify a philosophical argument. One doesn't need empirical evidence to make a philosophical case for something. I gladly admit that I do not have empirical evidence for creatio ex nihilo, but I'm not trying to make an empirical case for it. I'm making a philosophical case, and so is every other apologist that argues for it from a philosophical standpoint. And I also think for someone to claim that a philosophical argument needs to be supported by empirical evidence is self-defeating, because that very claim itself is a philosophical claim and can't be justified empirically. When we talk about creatio ex nihilo, we're abstracting, and that's what philosophical arguments are all about, to abstract away from the physical world. Bottom line, we do not need to provide empirical evidence of creatio ex nihilo in order to argue for it philosophically. We just need to provide philosophical reasoning. Now let's keep in mind, we're not arguing that creatio ex nihilo is something that anyone can do. We're arguing that it's something only God can do. So anytime we talk about creatio ex nihilo, it's necessarily going to be connected to God and his attributes, which is why we argue for it philosophically. Because of course we don't think anyone else is capable of creatio ex nihilo other than God. So for someone to claim that we need to provide a demonstration of creatio ex nihilo in the here and now really misses what's being argued in the first place. It's similar to me asking someone to provide a demonstration of the beginning of the universe in order to argue that it had a beginning. Now, of course, they can't provide that, but that doesn't at all negate the evidence for the beginning of the universe. Comparatively, the notion of creatio ex nihilo is not negated if someone can't demonstrate it in the here and now, because that was never the argument to begin with. Now, when it comes to the cosmological argument, we're reasoning from effect to cause. See, if matter had a beginning, which I believe the evidence shows that it did, then that means whatever caused matter would necessarily have to be outside of matter. That is to say, it would have to be immaterial, which of course means the universe couldn't have been created from pre-existing matter, because that would mean matter existed before it came into existence. So really all the atheists can do is try to argue that the universe is just eternal. But there really isn't any evidence that the universe is eternal. The evidence is very much in favor of the universe having a beginning. But if the material world had a beginning, then it couldn't have come from pre-existing material, because the material world couldn't have existed before it existed. That would be incoherent. Another thing to keep in mind as it pertains to creatio ex nihilo, even though we are arguing that the universe was created out of nothing, we're not arguing that it was created by nothing, or that it came into being from nothing. We're arguing that God created it without using any pre-existing material. Now, of course, I admit that I can't explain this scientifically, but I wouldn't expect to be able to, because this, of course, is beyond the realm of science, since it's beyond the natural world. And that, of course, is where philosophy comes in. Philosophy is more fundamental to reality than science, because science depends on a number of philosophical assumptions. You can do philosophy without science, but you can't do science without philosophy. But like I stated earlier, when we talk about creatio ex nihilo, we're reasoning from effect to cause. If the effect is the material world coming into existence, which is what I think the scientific and philosophical evidence supports, then it couldn't have come from already existing material, which means creatio ex materia isn't an option, and creatio ex nihilo is the rational conclusion. Now, do we have absolute proof that creatio ex nihilo took place? No, but I think that we have good evidence for it from a philosophical standpoint. So even if I can't demonstrate something in the here and now coming into being out of nothing, that's okay. Because the case we're making with the cosmological argument is from a philosophical standpoint and not from an empirical standpoint. So when atheists claim that a philosophical argument doesn't hold in the absence of empirical evidence, I think they kind of miss the point. The whole point of a philosophical argument is to go beyond the empirical, especially if we're talking about the distant past like the beginning of the universe. So this objection doesn't at all derail the cosmological argument or the notion of creatio ex nihilo, but rather it just misses the point of the argument altogether.